today's talk is about contaminants, which is really, we're trying to justify why we're treating water. Okay, so like what's the problem that we're dealing with? And hence why is this class really important? Drinking water contaminants. Okay, so let's go. So I'll talk a little bit about history. I really enjoy history because it gives you a sense of what we have been assuming as we've been developing our understandings. And I feel like by studying a little bit of history, you can more easily understand that what we think we know now might not actually be right, because you can look back in history and see people who were dead certain about many, many things. And then you can look back and you can say, oh, but they should have known that wasn't right. So a reading of history on any subject is worth a lot. So a little bit of history on our understanding of waterborne disease, and then some on drinking water standards. So just a few like important dates. And it gives you a sense of like how things happened and how developments in water treatment didn't like follow some nice logical progression. Like it wasn't that we first figured out that there were germs, there were disease-bearing organisms in water, and then we decided that we were going to try to remove those pathogens. No, we like had this sense that water was somehow dirty, and so whatever that meant. And so the first slow sand filter, the first sand filter, was used to treat some of London's water back in 1829, which is pre-germ theory. 1850, John Snow established the link between drinking water from a contaminated well and cholera. So there's the famous case where John Snow did a little bit of epidemiology, figured out who was getting sick and dying, realized that they were all in this neighborhood or mostly in this neighborhood, concluded that it was the thing that they all had in common was drinking from this well, and ended up removing the pump handle to take that well out of service. And that was a really cool engineering act to prevent people from using a really contaminated water source. And that was also before germ theory was well understood. Here in the United States, Poughkeepsie, New York installs the first filter. And where's Poughkeepsie? Okay, you guys are from Ohio, you're not from New York State, so that's not fair. Do I have this right? I think I have Poughkeepsie as being south of Albany. And that's the story. It was south of Albany. Check me out on Google Maps and see if I got this right, but it's south of Albany. And so it was getting Albany's untreated wastewater in the Hudson River and was using that as its water source. And so things weren't going well for folks in Poughkeepsie. There was a lot of people getting sick and dying. And so they installed a filter. And then a few years later, we finally realized that, oh yeah, these sand filters amazingly are removing bacteria. And we'll talk about filters, weeks down the road. But one of the amazing things is if you look at a filter and look how it's made and look at how big the pores are inside the filter, the idea that it removes bacteria makes absolutely no sense. So this is a wonderful case where people invented a solution that solved the problem, where if they had known what the problem was, they would have thought their solution didn't make any sense. But happily, they didn't know what the problem was that they were trying to solve, and they tried something that worked. Just amazing. Okay, and then there's this case of a cholera outbreak in Hamburg, Germany. I'll come to that in a little bit later. And I feel like you can't talk about the whole issue of essentially waterborne disease without talking about toilets. So toilets are these amazing devices that take perfectly clean, drinkable water and turn it into wastewater. So it's an engineering device that does exactly what we don't want anything to do. So you have clean water in, dirty water out. But they did this amazing thing where they made cities habitable. They removed human waste from cities by connecting, assuming that you had a sewer that you could tie these to. That meant that the water that you used to flush the toilet carried the waste down the sewer, and that meant that there wasn't so much human waste easily accessible in the city. And so that was a good thing right at that level of the city. Unfortunately, as it carried the waste away was too close in many cases. So those sewers, remember, this is before people were thinking about treatment. And so those sewers just went right to the local water body, whether it was the nearby river. So think about the Thames River in London, or it could have gone to a lake. And we'll talk about Chicago in a second. London drained its raw sewage into and withdrew its drinking water out of the Thames River. So you can imagine that creates a bit of a problem, and I'll show a lovely graphic of that in a second. So first, the case of Chicago. So here's Chicago, and there's Lake Michigan. And what Chicago did is it was dumping its sewage into the lake, and it was also bringing its water out of the lake. And so it had a closed system, and that kind of worked because Lake Michigan is huge, but not a good idea. And if the currents go wrong, you could imagine some of your wastewater getting right into your intake for your drinking water plant. And except there was no drinking water plant, it just was into the city. And so that was no good. And I love this solution. You know what the folks, the engineers in Chicago figured out? They looked at this problem and they're like, okay, the problem is that our sewage is ending up in the lake, and that's our drinking water. So if the sewage didn't end up in the lake, that would solve our problem. How could we make this so that the sewage doesn't end up in our lake? And they came up with a very clever idea that if you just go about 20 miles and just a few feet up in elevation, you end up in the Mississippi watershed. And so all they had to do was lift their wastewater a tiny bit, get it over that tiny, tiny ridge, and all their wastewater goes down to Mississippi instead of into Lake Michigan, and their problem is solved. And you should be, as Michael is, kind of hanging his head in shame, realizing, oh, great, that solved the problem for Chicago, but there are just a few cities and towns downstream on the Mississippi that aren't going to be so happy with that solution. But that's what happened. Go back to London. So there, they were dumping their wastewater into the Thames and taking their wastewater, their drinking water out. And so I love this quote: "A portion of the inhabitants of the metropolis are made to consume in some form or another a portion of their own excrement, and moreover, to pay for the privilege." So there was some unhappy writing about this situation, and there was a wish for, there ought to be a better solution than this. So here's a cartoon about that, and I just want to highlight, okay, so this is, you can see the kind of the black streams, which are representing sewage getting dumped into the Thames River, and then Neptune is sitting on the intake for the water supply and showing all this excrement coming into that water supply. And I know that the image is not great, but you can make out maybe a few of the sayings, like it's devilish thick and it makes me sick. And there's a line about give us clean water. And there's a line about sewer. Why, there are 130 such. There are 130 sewer outfalls coming into the Thames River. And why do you drink that? So, so London had a different problem, and they had to send their sewage somewhere. And so it's interesting, London, the engineers in England worked at both figuring out how to treat their wastewater and how to treat the drinking water. So instead of adopting the Chicago approach, they worked on treatment at both ends. Here's another really interesting case. This is the case of Hamburg, Germany, and a large outbreak of cholera with 8,600 people dying. So this is a major, major event in 1892. And what's interesting is you see here the Elbe River flowing right to left, and you see that Hamburg has some of their sewer outfalls upstream of Altoona. And just like Poughkeepsie started treating their drinking water because they were getting Hudson River water that was contaminated from Albany upstream, same thing happened here, where Altoona, they kind of had this sense that, oh, this isn't good, we got to treat this water. And so Altoona has sand filter beds that they're using to treat the water because they realize that they're drinking the excrement from Hamburg. So they treat their water. And then Hamburg has this really nasty cholera outbreak. And cholera makes you sick, makes your digestive system go to town. You produce tons of cholera in your excrement. And so that was going down to sewers and down the Elbe towards Altoona's intake. And yet the folks in Altoona didn't get sick. And that's like, oh, that's interesting. If we understand how the water was flowing and where the intakes were located, Altoona should have been hit really, really hard. And so apparently their filters saved them. And if we look in more detail, this is looking at the boundary between Altoona and Hamburg, and the filled in dots are cholera cases, and the open dots are cases in Altoona where they drank water in Hamburg or they worked in Hamburg, and so they drank water there. And so you see that this political division really matches where people were getting sick, and all the evidence points to it was actually the water supply on the Hamburg side because the pipes stopped at the political border. So the conclusions from this is that cholera was waterborne and that they were using slow sand filters, and that slow sand filters may have, I'll be careful, I won't say it did because we don't know for sure, but slow sand filtration may have protected Altoona. So just very interesting. So some contaminants you might be thinking about is, oh, you're not really a fan of having cholera in your drinking water. And now you're realizing, oh, there's this fecal oral pathway. So people who get infected with these waterborne diseases then have excrement that's loaded with those pathogens. And so we want to break this fecal oral pathway. And this is showing there are tons of ways that you can go from human excrement. It could contaminate the groundwater, it could contaminate the surface water, it could end up on the land and contaminate the soil or be indeed picked up by crops that are planted in the soil. And so if you didn't wash the crops before you ate them, you could end up having pathogens on those crops. And so you'd have a path for ingesting some of those pathogens. There's so many paths, and then the question is, well, which are the paths that you have to worry about most? And of course, you should worry a little bit about all of them. It makes it clear that washing your hands, which I'm sorry to report, can be a direct fecal oral pathway, okay? So washing your hands is really, really important. And obviously the water that you drink is important. And basically anything that you put in your mouth ends up being of concern because you're trying to break that loop. So I get really excited about hand washing. I think that hand washing is actually one of the key things for public health. Yeah, I'll go down that path here. What device in your home or your dorm makes it easy for you to wash your hands? You know, we talked about the toilet, but the other critical infrastructure is the sink. And if I could, like, you know, flash my magic wand and make things happen, I would want everyone on the planet to have a functional sink in their home, a place where they and where their children who are 4 years old can easily wash their hands. And there's interesting studies about how people, how the amount of typhoid in the United States dropped off over time. And that's a whole other conversation. But it took a long time for typhoid to go away. And my favorite hypothesis is that the reason it took a long time is because it was correlated with when indoor plumbing and sinks got installed so that people could actually wash their hands. That's hypothesis. I don't have any proof. We can't go back and actually rerun that experiment. But I hope you come away thinking that maybe washing your hands is important. Okay, so let's take this. Here's an interesting opportunity. It's a really cool device that's called the Life Straw. This is current technology. I don't know, it's a number of years old. It's been out there for a while, and it can be a way to deliver safe water to people where they don't have access to safe water. And I would like you, and man, I could send you into breakout rooms, but I think let's not. You could just look at this and ponder for a second, but I'd like to hear from a couple of you after a minute. What do you think are potential fecal oral pathways for this device? So think about it. You have to be like a real critical engineer and think about, how does the user actually use this? What are the steps, and where are the potential fecal oral pathways, and how do you make sure that you break them? So think about an individual who's somewhere where there is no safe water anywhere. The only water available is contaminated water. What are they going to do? How are they going to use this device? And what do you see as potential pathways for still getting sick, even though you're drinking water that was absolutely safe? So supposing that's the case, supposing this is on a lanyard. Matter of fact, they have the little hooks there at the top to hang a string on it. So you're carrying it, or it's. Now, what are some additional pathways? And Isaac doesn't have to answer all of them. Feel free to jump in, someone else, or Isaac is allowed to continue.
Could there be like aerial contaminants?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you look at this environment, it looks like it could well be a dusty environment. And it's entirely possible for pathogens to be kicked up in the dust and be airborne and land on the device that you're about to stick your mouth around. Okay, and then where does your mouth go? Right on that top. And where was that top previously? It was just hanging around. So like a flaw in the design of this device is that the place where you stick your mouth isn't actually protected. Yes, they have a little cap for the very top, but they didn't think about where your lips go. Your lips are going to go down even further than that. And so if they were being really careful, you'd need a bigger lid that completely covers where your lips are going to go. And you see this lovely picture of a child drinking from water that looks quite turbid. It's cloudy. It's cloudy because there are particles in that water that are reflecting light or refracting light, one of the two. So what's going to happen as you're drinking that kind of water? By mass conservation, those particles end up in the filter, and that filter is going to start being more and more difficult to pull water through because those particles are going to add to resistance. I've never used a Life Straw, so I can't comment further, but I just know that if you're drinking really, really dirty water, you're going to have problems. I think there are methods to kind of rinse these filters, but it's a messy solution. But if you don't have a water treatment plant, this might be the best thing you have. So there's